What does grace produce? It produces righteousness. Hebrews 5:13, about this we have much to say, and it is hard to explain since you have become dull of hearing. God, help us not to be dull of hearing. For though by the time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you again the basic principles of the oracles of God. You need milk, not solid food. What's the framework for this? For everyone who lives on milk is unskilled in this thing Paul describes as the word of righteousness. I personally believe Paul wrote Hebrews, but I should say the writer of Hebrews. Everyone who lives on milk. See, we ought to be further down the road. We can't be dull of hearing. How you hear and what you hear is what informs your faith. Right? Faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word. Our faith is either enlarged or shrunk based on the strength of the word within us to sharpen our hearing to produce faith. And we ought to be further along, but because we're dull of hearing, we need teachers to give us enough milk to graduate us to solid food. But everyone who lives on milk is unskilled in the word of righteousness. Since he is a child, but solid food is for the mature. I hope over these sessions to give you meat to chew on. What is the word of righteousness? Romans 4. Verse 11. Abram received circumcision as a seal of the righteousness that he had by faith while still uncircumcised. The purpose was to make him the father of all who believe. Skip down to verse 13. For the promise to Abraham and his offspring that he would be heir of the world did not come through the law, but through the righteousness of faith. For if it is the adherents of the law who are to be the heirs, faith is null and the promise is void. Why? Because the law brings wrath. Where there is no law, there is no transgression. That is why it depends on faith, in order that the promise may rest on grace and be guaranteed to all his offspring, not only to the adherents of the law, but also to those who share the faith of Abraham, who is the father of us all. I hope I can articulate this to give you an aha moment. I know people interact with the word differently, and sometimes these things, all the words can just run together, the sentences and the concepts, and it's like, man, I feel like he's saying something really important there, but I just don't know what it is. And this idea that Abraham is the father of faith that produced righteousness, it says the promise of Abraham had to come by faith so that the promise through Abraham could be guaranteed. That's what he says in verse 16. That's why it depends on faith, in order that the promise may rest on grace and be guaranteed to all his offspring. Abraham was promised generations, descendants like the stars, more numerous than the sands of the seashores. Kings would come from him, and eventually all the earth would be blessed through him. We're about to get into looking at the Abrahamic covenant as a precursor to the covenant of grace. We're about to look at this, but this passage is saying Abraham possessed righteousness by faith, and we just heard the writer of Hebrews say there's a word of righteousness that's for the mature, but if you aren't skilled in the word of righteousness, you just have to stay in the milk zone. And we need to have our ears opened so that we can be activated in faith to apprehend and move into maturity in the word of righteousness. Abraham received promises that were meant through all generations, correct? Abraham's promise was meant to extend to all of mankind. And in fact, the promise that all the earth would be blessed is a messianic prophecy that the Savior would come through Abraham's family and all the earth would be blessed through him. Paul picks up on Abraham constantly in the New Testament to talk about the work of Christ in the life of the believer is us inheriting the promises that were made to Abraham. So Abraham had so many promises, and I'm going to show you in a minute, the promises made to Abraham will offend us when you properly understand them. But how can they be guaranteed? How can they be guaranteed if the system is based on law that guarantees failure? No one can complete the law. And so if Abraham was going to receive promises that all generations were meant to receive through him, it could not possibly be based on law, because the very next generation would blow it. And the promise would stop. So for God to be faithful to his own word, I'm promising you about this through you, Abraham. It's going to extend to the end of time and all generations will be blessed. It has to operate on a different kind of righteousness. Because the righteousness that comes by the law is going to produce more failure than successes. I'm not going to cover all of that ground again, but the law will provoke the very thing in you that it is warning you not to do. So Abraham, I'm going to give you all kinds of promises. Now, do it right. Make sure you do it right. And all the generations will be blessed in you. Boom, it's over. By the time of Isaac, it's ruined. So it has to come from a different mechanism. And Abram dared to believe God, and God set up the terms with Abraham so that the invitation was entirely based on faith. And Abram responded in faith, and God responded with abundant promises out of that faith. And because it was faith in God who can supply the grace to produce the righteousness, now he's got something that can endure through all generations, because everyone can believe. He moves in us both to will and to do. He actually deposits, he produces, he invites us to faith. I can fail 100 times at the law, and I can believe 101 in the righteousness of God. So by faith, the promise is able to extend through all generations. But we're still dealing with this challenge of the word of righteousness. So we're talking about Abraham. And, circumcision as a sign, the seal of righteousness. And it's a promise that extends through all generations. And what we're talking over and over again, the righteousness of Christ and the relationship between righteousness and holiness. And these things start to get fuzzy. Righteousness can be a fuzzy concept. It's like, I think I know what it is, but I'm not sure that I know what it is. And Dean, for a while now, I'm not sure that you're helping me. What is righteousness? We get it and then it slips away. Law thinking creeps back in. Let me give you a very simple legal and relational framework. Righteousness, the essence of righteousness, comes from the concept of right standing. That's what righteousness is right standing. So to be righteous before God is to be positioned with right standing before God. Righteousness as right standing is the qualitative and relational status determined by fidelity to the terms of God's covenant. So, to be in right standing is a legal equation that has terms with it. If I'm in right standing, you could be in right standing on a loan. You could be in right standing on a payment. You could be in right standing in any number of situations that have legal definitions, and if you're fulfilling the terms of the contract, you're in right standing. Covenant is a relational contract far exceeding the limits and power of a contract. Covenant is a hyper contract. So, to be in right standing, you have to know the terms of the covenant that determines your standing. So righteousness is right standing determined by fidelity to the terms of God's covenant. Let me simplify that. Righteousness is obedience to the terms of the covenant. You are righteous if you are following what the covenant prescribes by which you are in right standing. That was kind of circular, but here's the challenge. You have to know which covenant you're under for the righteousness you want to produce and how you're going to produce it. and this is the challenge of the Old Covenant and the New Covenant, both have terms for righteousness. Both have terms to be in right standing. I can be in right standing according to the Old Covenant. I can be in right standing according to the New Covenant. But if I just hear the word covenant and assume that it's all the same, I'm actually going to strive for and attempt to produce right standing, perhaps in conflict with the terms of the covenant I seek to fulfill. If I try to fulfill the new covenant according to the terms of the old covenant, I'm not in the right covenant. So righteousness is not divorced from the terms of the covenant, and you have to know which covenant you're seeking to live in. Well, here's the two choices. Romans 10 rather. Moses writes about the righteousness that is based on the law. The law was the Mosaic covenant. It's the old covenant. So Moses writes about the righteousness based on the law, that the person who does the commandments shall live by them. Now this is the choice in the garden. The two trees in the garden, do this and live. Eat from this tree and die. The choice is between life and death, the tree of life and the death that comes by the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The commandment based on the law is if you do the commandment, you'll live. That is how you are in right standing according to the old covenant. You do it and you live. Romans, however, describes the righteousness of the new covenant. In the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, for the righteous will live by faith. In the old covenant, the terms are do the commandment. In the new covenant, you believe and are counted righteous. Two very different terms, the same God possessing the same righteousness. Which way do you get to his righteousness? You do the commandments and satisfy that requirement, and you touch his righteousness. Different covenant, different terms. Believe and receive his righteousness.